Welcome to Mr. Night Whisperer TT. Tonight, let's drift together into the misty hills of Tuscany. Not the postcard perfect version with golden lights spilling over vineyard rows, but the other one. The one where fog clings low in the valleys and whispers through the cypress trees like a voice desperate to confess. Florence, 1985. That's where I found myself, jet-lagged, wearing a stranger's trench coat I'd grabbed from the lost and found at Fiumicino Airport, dragging a suitcase down a gravel road just outside Scandicci. I wasn't there for the wine. I was there because of a file. One no one asked me to read, but somehow it ended up on my desk like a dare. And tucked at the bottom of that manila folder, behind faded photographs and blood-smeared topography maps, were two names, Pia Rontini and Claudio Stefanacci. I was about to learn what it means to be hunted while in love. But before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, only if you truly enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments, where are you watching from? And what time is it where you are right now? The sun had barely risen when I reached the farmhouse, abandoned since the late 80s. Windows boarded up, ivy clawing its way up the stone walls. But in the back, through a door that looked untouched since the Cold War, I found the archive. Wooden boxes stacked like a forgotten maze, each marked in black marker. Via degli Scopetti, 1985. Cascine, 1984. Vicchio, 1981. One name kept repeating, Il Mostro, the monster. They don't use that word lightly in Italy. This wasn't tabloid drama. It was the name given to a shadow that haunted Florence for over a decade. A serial killer who never left witnesses, never left fingerprints, who always struck where lovers went to be alone. They say monsters hide in the dark, but this one hunted under moonlight when lovers locked their car doors thinking they were safe. I opened the first box. Inside was a plastic bag containing an old police photograph, dated a cold September morning in 1985. Two young lovers found in a small red Fiat Panda, bullet holes in the windshield. Doors still locked. The girl's body had been tampered with. That was the word in the official report, manipulato, cold, clinical. But underneath it was a truth Florence could barely speak aloud. This killer didn't just kill. He mutilated, he displayed, he performed. The monster's killings officially began in 1974. Two young lovers parked near a wheat field outside Borgo San Lorenzo, shot through the windshield. No witnesses, no known motive. The weapon? A .22 caliber Beretta long rifle loaded with Winchester Series H bullets. That specific detail would later become the only solid thread tying all the killings together. But something was strange about that first case. The man was married to someone else, a local scandal. And when the police arrested the wife's cousin for the murder, it seemed like a clean resolution, a crime of passion, simple, solvable. Except the killings didn't stop. Fast forward to 1981. Same method, same bullets, same target profile, young couples in secluded places. That's when the police began to wonder, had they convicted the wrong man? Had the real killer been free this entire time? Or worse, had he never even been found? I looked down at my notes. 12 confirmed victims, 7 different locations, 11 years, one killer. Maybe. But Florence didn't like the term serial killer, not in the 1980s. That was an American problem, they said. A Hollywood fantasy. Italians didn't kill like that, but someone did. And whoever he was, he knew those back roads better than the local police. He was always 2 steps ahead, always silent, always surgical. One thing that kept appearing in the reports was the killer's use of location. The crime scenes weren't random. They were all isolated, rural areas on the outskirts of small towns, each within driving distance of Florence. All had minimal police presence. The strangest part? No one ever heard the gunshots. Locals would wake to birdsong and espresso, only to find bodies in their vineyards. Some claimed the killer used a silencer. Others said the winding roads absorbed the sound. But the strangest theory came from an old Carabinieri officer who once said, half joking, half serious, the monster's bullets made no sound because the devil himself held the barrel. To this day, scholars still debate whether the silence was tactical or psychological. Did the killer return to the scene and move the bodies? Did he manipulate Tuscany's soundscape like a composer? It sounds insane. But the longer you study the case, the more dreamlike, no, nightmarish it becomes. There was one more item in the box, a small Polaroid, an evidence marker stuck in a dirt path. On the back in smudged blue ink, someone had written, "Start here." And so I did. With every page I turned, I fell deeper into the case that swallowed Florence, into the myth of a man no one ever saw, and into a question that still haunts me. Are monsters just stories we tell? Or do some of them sip espresso and drive Fiats, just like the rest of us? There's something poetic about Italian summers, long evenings thick with warmth, the air heavy with the scent of cypress and ripe grapes. But that was also when fear crept in. Because when the sun dipped behind the Tuscan hills, the people of Florence began locking their doors. And lovers stopped parking their cars in the countryside. The monster had a type. It wasn't about the victims themselves. It was about the setting. Young couples, in cars, hidden beneath olive trees or tucked behind vineyard rows. The places you'd go to kiss, to argue, or to nap beneath the stars, those were his hunting grounds. Now, we're going back to the beginning. June 6th, 1981. Signa, a small town just 12 miles from Florence. Carmela Denuccio, age 21, and Giovanni Foggi, age 30. She was a typist. He worked in a warehouse. They were dating in secret. Her family didn't approve. That night, they parked near a field off Via dell'Arigo just before midnight. No lights, no houses, just the hum of crickets and the occasional snap of a falling pine cone. At 6:30 the next morning, a farmer found them. Carmela's body had been dragged about 40 feet from the car. Giovanni was still inside, slumped over the steering wheel, 2 bullets in his neck. But what chilled even the most seasoned officers wasn't the violence, it was the precision. The gun was once again a .22 caliber Beretta, loaded with the same Winchester H bullets used in the 1974 murders. Carmela had been mutilated, surgically, some said. Not random, not frenzied, deliberate. You'd think the killer was some drifter, right? Some shadow slipping in and out of towns. But here's the strange thing. The crime scene was clean. No footprints, no cigarette butts, nothing dropped or disturbed. It was as if he had floated in, done what he came to do, and vanished. Stranger still, the car doors were locked. There were no defensive wounds, no sign either of them tried to run. It was as if, somehow, they never saw him coming. Maybe they were asleep. Maybe he knocked, pretending to be a cop. Or maybe, and this was a theory some police whispered but never wrote down, he was already nearby, watching, patient. This second killing changed everything. The 1974 murders had been forgotten, written off as a domestic dispute. But now, 7 years later, the same weapon, the same method, that wasn't coincidence. That was signature. That was ritual. Florence hadn't yet called him a monster, but the newspapers were circling. One headline read, "L'amante oscuro, the dark lover returns." That's when the fear took hold. You have to understand, Florence isn't a massive metropolis like New York or London. It's dense and historical, but intimate. People know each other. Families go back generations. So when news spread about Carmela and Giovanni, it wasn't just a crime story. It was personal. Parents warned their daughters not to go out at night. Bars started closing earlier. Police increased patrols on rural roads, but it was never enough. Never in time. Now, here's a detail I can't shake, even now. At both scenes, the one in 1974 and this one in 1981, the victims' pockets had been turned inside out. But nothing was stolen. Not the watches, not the money, not the cigarettes. Why? Some investigators believed it was symbolic. Others said it was part of completing the ritual. Scholars still debate whether it was psychological, perhaps obsessive-compulsive behavior, or a chilling message. I'm not here to rob you. I'm here to destroy something else. Let me tell you something odd. In 1981, Italian radio stations began receiving anonymous postcards, postmarked from Florence, no return address. Some had single words, others included Bible verses, almost always from Leviticus. One read, "I have spared the married." Creepy, right? But it hinted at something that would soon become clear. Every couple the monster targeted was unmarried, often entangled in secret or socially taboo relationships. Lovers, not spouses. Some speculated he was trying to cleanse the impure, a twisted sense of morality, a sexual grievance. Others believed he acted on behalf of something darker. And that's a theory you'll hear often in this case, that the monster of Florence wasn't just one man, but the instrument of a group, a cult, or a secret society. It sounds conspiratorial, but after a few more murders and a few missing organs, people started paying attention. I've read police statements from 1981. One officer, who never spoke publicly, wrote this in his private log. Open quote, "This was not an animal. It was a surgeon or a hunter with a purpose we don't understand." Close quote. He was right about the purpose part. But here's the question. Did the monster really go silent between 1974 and 1981? Or were there other victims, never connected? One theory suggests he practiced on animals in the meantime. Stray dogs, livestock, even roadkill. That he honed his methods until he was ready to return to human prey. A farmer in Prado claimed dozens of his goats were found dead in 1979, each sliced open in the exact same way Carmela had been. But it was dismissed. Because back then, the idea of a serial killer in Italy was still laughable. Not anymore. Carmela and Giovanni's murders weren't just horrific. They were a message. And by 1981, Florence had started to listen. Sleep lightly tonight. We've only just begun. You know what's more terrifying than a serial killer? The idea that there could be two. That was the whisper spreading through Florence after the next attack. Not a scream, just a whisper. Because in a city this old, this tightly wound, whispers carry weight. You don't need to shout to cause panic. You just need a pattern. And then one thing that breaks it. October 23rd, 1981. Just 4 months after the murder of Carmela and Giovanni, another couple was found dead. This time, it was Susanna Cambi, age 24, and her boyfriend Stefano Baldi, 26. They were discovered in a car parked on a rural hilltop near Calenzano, just outside Florence. And the first thing police noticed? The MO was identical. Same type of gun, a .22 Beretta long rifle. Same kind of ammunition, Winchester H-series bullets. Same surgical mutilation to the female victim. But one detail didn't match. He moved the bodies. Unlike the earlier crimes, where victims were found in or near their vehicle, this time, Susanna had been dragged from the car, stripped and positioned in a grotesque display. Stefano had been shot in the head and was found slumped over the hood. The car's passenger side window was shattered. A flashlight lay on the ground nearby, its lens cracked. That may sound like a small difference, but to investigators, it was a major problem. Because this time, the killer didn't just attack, he staged. And staging indicated a change in behavior, which meant one of two things. Either the killer had evolved, or someone else had taken over. The idea of a copycat terrified investigators. If more than one person was involved, how would they find him, them, before the next attack? A strange fact emerged from this crime scene. The killer had cleanly, deliberately removed Susanna's left breast and taken it with him. Nothing else was missing. Not her wallet, not her jewelry. Just that. No explanation made sense, not in any rational human context. Some detectives suspected necrophilia. Others believed it was a reenactment of some personal nightmare. But a third group, quieter, older, more experienced, wondered if the killer had a purpose, a ritual, maybe even a client. I know, it sounds wild, but this is Florence, a city that once burned heretics in the same century it painted the ceiling of the Duomo. Contradiction is the local language. Here's something else. The murders always took place near water, rivers, creeks, irrigation canals. Even when couples parked far away, the killer would drag one of the bodies closer. Why? Historians still debate whether this was symbolic, a form of purification, or just a coincidence. But nothing about this case has ever felt coincidental. You'd think, with 3 attacks now, each with clear similarities, they'd have something. A lead, a fingerprint, a name. Nope, not a single witness. No credible suspect. Not even a halfway decent composite sketch. The only people arrested so far were men who happened to live near the crime scenes and owned guns. One guy had a mustache and a reputation for spying on couples. He was held for 2 weeks, then released. No evidence. Meanwhile, the people of Florence began hunting the monster themselves. Newspapers offered cash rewards. Tabloids printed "Killer of Lovers" souvenirs. You could buy fake autopsy reports from street vendors. It became a sick cultural obsession. Romantic couples stayed in after dark. But tourists, they flocked to the city, drawn by the mystery. And that made the locals furious. This is where the copycat theory began to take root. Some aspects of this third crime didn't just feel different. They felt forced, as if someone had read about the earlier murders and tried to mimic them, poorly. One police profiler noted that the wounds on Susanna were less precise, sloppier, not surgical. He wrote, open quote, "The hand that cut was not the same as the hand that shot," close quote. That was when a new theory emerged. Maybe the monster was 2 people. One pulled the trigger. The other did the rest. Some speculated a master-apprentice relationship, that the killer was training someone, or worse, taking orders. The acts felt less like spontaneous violence and more like assignments. You see where this is going, don't you? That's how the rumors of a satanic cult first surfaced. It sounds absurd now, but in early 1980s Italy, where the church still held deep sway and occult panic was sweeping across Europe, the theory gained traction. Especially when paired with the surgical removal of, well, you know. A local priest even went on record claiming the killings were part of a black mass ritual. He was ridiculed publicly, but his words lingered. I've read the transcript. He said, open quote, "This monster is not one man. He is the dagger of something older, something that remembers fire and sacrifice." Close quote, not bad for a priest. But let's take a step back. Was this really a new killer? Or had the original monster become bolder, less careful? Maybe he felt untouchable after getting away with it for so long. Maybe the shift in behavior was intentional. He wanted to be noticed. After all, serial killers rarely remain static. They evolve, or they unravel. Still, it's hard to ignore the clean, surgical mutilation of Carmela and the chaotic, brutal disfigurement of Susanna. So if there was more than one monster, then Florence wasn't just being hunted. It was being watched by them. And we weren't looking in the wrong place. We were using the wrong number. By the time the 4th couple was murdered, Florence wasn't whispering anymore. It was screaming, with locked doors, bolted windows, and prayers that no longer worked. Something had changed after the Cambibaldi killings. Before, the monster had been a distant shadow. Now, he was breathing down the city's neck. June 19th, 1982. Antonella Migliorini and Paolo Mainardi, aged 20 and 22, were found shot inside their car near Bacaiano, just south of Florence. It was a familiar setup: secluded road, moonlit fields, a quiet night made quieter by the weight of dread. But this time, something went wrong. Paolo didn't die immediately. He was found still alive, slumped over the gearshift, bleeding from a gunshot wound to the head. He was rushed to the hospital. And for a brief, dizzying moment, Florence had hope. He was going to talk. He was going to name the monster, but Paolo never woke up. He died before dawn. Brain hemorrhage. It was as if fate had played a cruel joke, offering the city a glimpse of closure, only to snatch it away. And here's the strange part. Forensic analysis revealed something no one expected. Antonella had not been mutilated. For the first time since 1981, the killer broke his own pattern. Yes, he shot them, but then fled. Quickly, in a hurry. He didn't stay for the ritual. Police discovered fresh tire tracks near the scene. And get this, they also found marks suggesting that Paolo had tried to reverse the car. That's right, there had been a struggle. For the first time ever, someone had fought back. It didn't save them, but it rattled the monster. This killing sent Florence into a full-blown panic. Overnight, gun sales skyrocketed. Pharmacies ran out of pepper spray. Couples stopped going out altogether. Whole sections of the city turned into ghost towns after dark. This wasn't just fear, it was paralysis. You know that moment in horror films when the town realizes the killer isn't just out there, he's everywhere? Yeah, this was that moment. Parents began chaperoning their kids' dates. Cars parked near woods or farmland were routinely searched. At one point, the local police even considered a curfew, but the mayor rejected it, said it would send the wrong message. I guess being murdered sends a better one. Now here's a strange fact. A man walking his dog near the Bacciano crime scene claimed he saw a dark figure running through the olive trees, about 20 minutes before the bodies were found. Tall, lean, moving fast. But when police followed up, he refused to give a formal statement. Said he'd been drinking too much wine. Thing is, he didn't sound drunk on the original call. He sounded terrified. Some believe he saw the killer's face. Others think he saw something else, someone observing the crime rather than fleeing it. Historians still debate whether it was a hallucination brought on by fear or a genuine eyewitness account, buried by fear and red tape. Let's pause for a moment and recognize something. This wasn't just about a serial killer on the loose in Florence. It was about the fact that the police had absolutely no idea who he was, or how to even begin narrowing down a suspect. Remember, this was Italy in the 1980s. No widespread DNA testing, no criminal databases. The concept of criminal profiling barely existed, and certainly wasn't trusted. But something had to be done. So, in the summer of 1982, the Carabinieri launched Operazione Mastro, a massive task force created solely to catch the monster. Hundreds of officers were reassigned, cold files were reopened, victim connections were re-examined. And what did they find? Nothing. No links between the couples. No shared schools, workplaces, restaurants, or friends. The only common thread was this: they were young, in love, and parked. Operazione Mastro did what most massive investigations do when desperate. They started arresting suspects, ex-boyfriends, jealous classmates, that weird neighbor with a taxidermy hobby, all held, none charged. But here's a curious detail that emerged from the chaos. During one interrogation, a suspect reportedly said this: "You're looking for a wolf, but you'll never catch him if you think he hunts alone." The press never printed that line, but I found it buried in the transcript of an internal memo dated July 2nd, 1982. That line haunted me for days, because if that man was right, then everything Florence feared was just the surface. What if the monster wasn't one man? What if he was a pack? Meanwhile, the media had a frenzy. Every outlet gave the killer a new nickname. Some called him Il Mostro. Others dubbed him the Shadow Surgeon. One columnist simply called him Death in the Olive Trees. I have to admit, that one stuck with me. By the end of that summer, Florence was different. The air felt heavier, the nights quieter, people walked faster, even in daylight. And couples? They didn't just stop going out at night. They stopped being couples. Young lovers would have dinner together, then part ways before sunset. Love became dangerous, and fear killed romance better than any bullet ever could. Still, after June, the killer went silent for months, which somehow made it worse. Because in a city like Florence, when the monster is quiet, you don't breathe easier. You hold your breath. By October 1983, Florence had gone nearly a year without a new murder. People were still afraid, but not afraid enough to keep living like it was a ghost town. That's the thing about terror. Given enough time, it fades into something more like an inconvenience. But then, something shattered that fragile peace. It wasn't a murder. It wasn't even blood. It was a letter, a real handwritten letter, delivered directly to the office of Florence's chief prosecutor, Pierluigi Vigna. No return address, no fingerprints, just a neatly typed envelope containing a single sheet of paper folded in something else. A piece of human flesh. Yes, you read that right. Enclosed was a portion of a woman's breast, preserved somehow, meticulously excised. The handwriting? Slanted, masculine, almost elegant. The message? Open quote, "A little souvenir. You missed this." Close quote. Signed, open quote, "Un saluto dal vostro mostro." A greeting from your monster. Close quote. And just like that, the city broke again. Because here's the terrifying part. This wasn't from the 1982 murder. The flesh came from the 1981 killing of Carmela De Nuccio, 2 years earlier, which meant one of two things. One, the killer had preserved the body part for 2 full years. 2, or there was more than one person involved, and someone else had kept trophies and mailed it later. Either scenario sent chills through every cop and journalist in Florence. And if you think that's where the story ends, just wait. Because now, the bizarre overlaps with the absurd. The letter was postmarked from San Casciano, a quiet, idyllic wine country town just south of Florence. Rolling hills, vineyards, peaceful. But more importantly, it was the same town where a man named Pietro Pacciani lived. Remember that name. It'll come up again, often. At the time, he was just another local, a farmer. He'd served time for assaulting a girl in the 1950s, but hadn't drawn much attention since. Just another villager. But that postmark would come back like a boomerang, smacking Italian justice squarely in the face years later. Naturally, the media went wild. "He's taunting us," the headlines screamed. People began comparing the monster to Jack the Ripper, or worse, Zodiac. And honestly, the Zodiac comparison makes sense. Mysterious letters, lovers' lanes, complete anonymity, utter police confusion? Absolutely. But there's a key difference. The monster of Florence was surgical. He wasn't just killing, he was performing. Clean incisions, targeted mutilation, and above all, silence. Zodiac wanted attention. The monster wanted to be understood without speaking. Until now. Here's a strange fact. The paper used for the letter wasn't ordinary. Forensic tests revealed it came from a rare brand of French stationery, sold only in select stores in Marseille, Lyon, and, yes, Florence. Only 3 shops in the city carried it. Investigators questioned all the shop clerks, praying for a lead, and they got one, sort of. One store owner recalled a man buying several packs around 1980. Tall, slender, said he was a poet. See, a poet. He paid in cash and wore a black scarf. In summer. Cliché? Absolutely. Helpful? Not really. The police sketch looked like every noir villain or chain-smoking philosophy student you've ever seen. Gaunt, sunglasses, mysterious. To this day, historians still debate whether the poet was real or a fabrication for publicity. Some believe the clerk invented the entire story to gain media attention. But that letter changed everything. Now, it wasn't just about who the monster killed. It became about how long he had been planning, what he had been keeping, and how little the authorities truly understood. So they brought in new profilers, fresh eyes, experts from Rome. There were even whispers about help from the FBI, though that remains debated. They developed a psychological profile. Male, likely between 40 to 50, highly intelligent, socially isolated, obsessive-compulsive tendencies, knowledge of anatomy, possibly a doctor, butcher, or hunter. Pretty specific, right? The problem? That described half the men in rural Tuscany. Out there, butcher-hunter loner is practically a personality archetype. Meanwhile, citizens formed neighborhood watch groups, held candlelight vigils, tabloid reporters in trench coats flooded the streets, and through all of it, no murders, not a single one, for 15 months, until 1984. But let's not go there just yet, because before that year unraveled, there was one more twist. Ready? After receiving the letter, the police reopened old case files, ones from the 1960s and 1970s. And what did they find? A pair of lovers murdered in 1968 near Lake Bilancino, shot with the same kind of gun, same modus operandi, same eerie precision, same setting. And here's the kicker. A man had already been convicted for that 1968 crime. He'd served his sentence and was now living a quiet life. But when investigators retested the bullets with newer forensic technology, they matched the monster's .22 Beretta, which raised a terrifying question. Was that man wrongfully convicted back then? Or had the monster somehow come into possession of the same gun later? Either scenario suggested one thing. This killer's story ran much deeper than anyone ever imagined. That souvenir in the envelope? It wasn't a message. It was a warning. He was still here. He had never left, and he was just getting started. I remember when the newspapers changed their tone. Before, they speculated. After July 1984, they panicked. Because that summer, after 15 months of silence, the monster returned. And this time, he didn't just kill, he broke a pattern. Before this, all his victims had been young couples in parked cars, out in nature, places lovers went to be alone, places you could sneak up on. But on the night of July 29, 1984, something changed. The victims this time were Claudio Stefanacci, 21, and Pia Gilda Rontini, 18. Both were local. Both were sweethearts. But here's the catch. They weren't in a car. They were camping in a tent just off a country trail in Vicchio, in the Mugello Valley. Yes, still remote, but not the typical lover's lane. Not parked and exposed. They were hidden. The monster had adapted. Someone saw them walking together near a bar earlier that night. Nothing suspicious. They smiled, bought soft drinks. Pia laughed at a joke. Then they vanished into the woods. And by the next morning, they were dead. But this wasn't like the earlier killings. It was worse. Claudio had been shot 3 times with the signature .22 Beretta pistol. Same make, same ammo. Winchester Series H, copper-jacketed. But Pia, she had been dragged from the tent, taken a short distance away, and mutilated post-mortem. It was brutal, even for the monster. Her left breast had been excised. More disturbingly, her pubic area had been surgically removed, with what appeared to be a scalpel, no jagged knife, no clumsy slashing. This was precision. And you know what made it even more disturbing? The body parts were never found. Forensics officers spent days combing the area. Drones, dogs, metal detectors, but nothing. He took them with him to keep, a collector. That was the moment it clicked for many of the profilers. This wasn't just about control. It wasn't even just about killing. This was ritualistic harvesting. Now, I promised you strange facts, and here's one. The pathologist on that case noted that the mutilation on Pia's body appeared to have been done after death, but not long after, within 15 to 20 minutes, which meant the killer had stayed near the scene with a flashlight, performing surgical work in the dark. If that doesn't chill you, I don't know what will. By this point, the monster task force had swelled to over 100 officers. They weren't sleeping. They were staking out remote areas, interviewing hunters, scanning psychiatric records. And here's the academic debate I want to share with you. Was the monster acting alone? Italian criminologists like Francesco Bruno and journalist Mario Spezzi began to argue that the cleanliness, the surgical precision, and the lack of evidence pointed not to a single man, but to a small group, a kind of dark club. One killer to shoot, one to mutilate, another to drive. A ritual team. Sounds far-fetched? Maybe, but explain this. How did he keep disappearing so flawlessly every time? How did he carry away body parts without being seen or tracked by dogs? One man carrying mutilated flesh, a weapon, gloves, maybe a flashlight or surgical tools, and never once leaving a trace? Not even Zodiac was that clean. Anyway, the press exploded. People were saying the monster had returned stronger, crueler, that he was upgrading. He was, because just 2 months later, in September 1984, he struck again. This time in Borgo San Lorenzo. The victims, Horst Wilhelm Meyer, 24, a German student, and his girlfriend, Uwe Jens Rüsch, 24. They were traveling in a Volkswagen van, camping in a field. Not locals, tourists. And here's the twist that still haunts investigators. When police arrived, they found that Horst had been wearing women's clothes at the time of death. Uwe, too, appeared androgynous, short hair, masculine features, which led to a chilling theory. The monster may have thought they were a heterosexual couple. When he shot and discovered they were both male, he became enraged. Why? Because this time, there was no mutilation. The shooting matched the previous crimes, but no excision, no harvesting, no souvenir, which led investigators to think the monster didn't just target lovers, he targeted women, specifically their reproductive anatomy. It was like his rage or obsession required a specific female body to fulfill his ritual. No woman, no mutilation, just murder. Another thing? That same stationery from the 1983 letter, the rare French kind? It showed up again, tucked under the van's windshield. Nothing written on it, just a blank sheet. But it was the same stock, exact texture, brand, watermark. It was almost like he was marking territory, saying, "This was mine." Even when the victims didn't fit the mold. After that, the task force held a desperate press conference. They begged the public, do not camp in the countryside. Do not park in rural areas with your partner. But of course, not everyone listened. People still traveled, still made out, still lived. And the monster waited. Always for couples, always for the silence of rural Tuscany, and always with his .22 Beretta in hand. He wasn't just back, he was watching. And 1985, that would be the year everything exploded. If the summer of 1984 was the monster's crescendo, then 1985 was his final act. And believe me, it was his most calculated, most chilling performance yet. By that time, I had become obsessed with the case. I collected every newspaper clipping, every grainy photograph. I even wrote to Mario Spezzi, one of the few journalists demanding a deeper investigation. He never wrote back. But I think he understood. Some of us weren't just curious. We were trying to understand a darkness that didn't belong in our world. Because what happened in San Casciano on September 7th, 1985, made the world stop and stare. The victims were Nadine Mario, 36, and Jean-Michel Krevishvili, 25. French tourists. Engaged to be married, they had been sleeping in their Peugeot 104, parked under a tree by a vineyard. Same setup, same isolation, same ending. The monster crept up in the night, fired 4 shots. Jean-Michel managed to escape the car and ran nearly 30 meters before the killer chased him down in the dark and shot him twice in the back. That single detail terrified investigators. It meant the monster was willing to break cover. He wasn't just ambushing anymore. He was hunting. And he was confident. But that wasn't the worst of it. Back at the car, he turned to Nadine. He dragged her body away and mutilated her with surgical precision. Her body was staged. Her left breast and pubic area were cleanly removed. And once again, those parts were missing. Gone. Collected. Preserved? We'll never know. Now here's where the case shifts from terrifying to unbelievable. Just 2 days later, on September 9th, a plain envelope arrived at the office of Dr. Silvia Della Monica, the prosecutor leading the case. No return address, no name. Just one thing inside. A small piece of Nadine Morio's breast wrapped in paper. Let me say that again. He mailed a piece of his victim's flesh to the lead prosecutor on the case. This wasn't a killer hiding anymore. This was a killer taunting. He was saying, "You can't stop me. I do what I want. I see everything." The letter wasn't signed, but investigators quickly matched the stamp and stationery to, yes, the same rare French paper used in the 1983 and 1984 killings. So now there was a physical connection, a link spanning 3 years. A killer who kept trophies, studied his targets, and was bold enough to deliver human remains to the justice system. If that isn't psychological warfare, I don't know what is. Here's your strange fact of the night. That envelope was not mailed. It was hand-delivered to the prosecutor's office. No fingerprints, no hair, nothing. Which meant someone, either the killer himself or someone he sent, walked right up to the main legal institution in Florence with a piece of a woman's body and left it there, unseen. And now, the academic debate that has divided Italian criminology for decades. Was this still one killer, or had the monster become a mask for something much deeper? After the 1985 killings, investigators began to seriously consider a theory that once sounded like the stuff of conspiracy, that the monster wasn't just a lone madman, but part of a ritualistic group, possibly a sect, engaged in occult or esoteric practices. The theory suggested the murders were performed to collect specific body parts. Those parts were used in rituals, possibly sexual or fertility related. The killer wasn't acting alone. He was working for someone. A client, someone ordering the harvest. Sound crazy? Not to investigative judge Paolo Canessa. Years later, he reopened the files and insisted this was not one madman. This was a market of murder. In fact, a local doctor named Francesco Narducci was quietly investigated after his death. He had drowned in 1985 under mysterious circumstances. Some claimed he had ties to an elite circle that used body parts in rituals rooted in ancient Tuscan magic. Still sound far-fetched? Well, consider this. After 1985, the killings stopped entirely. No more Monster of Florence murders. But serial killers don't just stop, not after a decade of compulsion and ritual, unless the demand had ended or the killer had been silenced. The police never publicly announced a capture. They arrested several men, Pietro Pacciani, Mario Vanni, even a farmer named Giancarlo Lotti. Each had suspicious histories. Each confessed, then recanted. Some claimed they had been hired, but in court, the evidence crumbled. Pacciani was convicted, then acquitted. Vanni died in prison, still declaring his innocence. The real monster? Still debated, still unknown. Some believe the killer was never caught. Others say he died quietly, rich and free. And some believe he was just the knife, while someone else held the map. All I know is this. When I drive through the Tuscan countryside now, past the fields and olive groves, past the shadows of those old farmhouses, I still wonder, is someone out there, remembering? Someone with a box, filled with letters and flesh. They called it Il caso che non vuole morire, the case that wouldn't die. After the final murder in 1985, it would have been natural to assume things would quiet down. But in truth, the Monster of Florence simply changed form, from a killer in the dark to a ghost within the justice system. And I kept following every twist like it was religion. You see, even though the killings stopped, the damage didn't. The monster hadn't only mutilated bodies, he had mutilated the faith of an entire country. By the late 1980s, the Italian public had turned against its own police. Why? Because no one was being held accountable. There had been multiple arrests, multiple confessions, and still no resolution. Let's walk through the chaos. First, there was Salvatore Vinci, an immigrant from Sardinia. His own brother, Francesco, had once dated one of the early victims from 1968, the original copycat monster killing. Salvatore had a violent past, but the charges were dropped. No evidence. Then came Pietro Pacciani, a 68-year-old farmer with a history of rape and violence, living in the hills near several of the crime scenes. Pacciani was an unsettling figure, gruff, paranoid. He buried documents in his garden. He owned an old Luger pistol, and he had once assaulted his own daughters. The press labeled him the ugly Tuscan, and the prosecution leaned heavily on that image. In 1994, Pacciani was convicted of 7 of the monster murders, but in 1996, the appellate court overturned the verdict. The judges ruled the evidence was too circumstantial. No DNA, no eyewitnesses, no murder weapon. He was a terrible man, yes, but was he the monster? No one could prove it. Then came the real shock. Before his retrial could begin in 1998, Pacciani died suddenly, heart failure, alone in his farmhouse. He died a free man. And here's the strange fact of the night. When police searched his home after his death, they found boxes of pornographic magazines, letters about ritual practices, and something even darker, a hidden photograph of a mutilated female body. Not one of the monster's known victims. So the debate intensified. Was Pacciani the killer after all? Or just another false lead in a case built on shadows? That leads us to the academic debate, one that still echoes in books, documentaries, and criminal justice classrooms across Europe. Is it possible for a modern police force to fail so completely, not by incompetence, but by deliberate misdirection? Because after Pacciani's death, 2 of his supposed accomplices, Mario Vanni and Giancarlo Lodi, were also arrested. Lodi, who was mentally unstable, confessed that they had killed together. Pacciani would shoot, then Vanni would mutilate. They were dubbed I compagni di merende, literally the snack buddies. Yes, that was the police's theory, that 3 aging farmers and small-town laborers had formed a serial killer club. Critics called it absurd, but the courts didn't. Vanni and Lodi were convicted in 2000. Still, no murder weapon was ever recovered. No photos of victims in their homes. No trophies. Nothing physical tied them to the actual scenes. So, the public split in 2. One side believed the case was finally closed. The other believed the monster had never been caught, and the snack buddies were convenient scapegoats. Then something truly strange happened. In the early 2000s, investigative journalist Mario Spezzi, the same man I had once written to, published a book titled Dolci Colline di Sangue, Sweet Hills of Blood. In it, he claimed the real monster was still out there, protected by a powerful network of men in Tuscany, doctors, lawyers, aristocrats, who used the murders for ritualistic purposes. He specifically pointed to Francesco Narducci, the mysterious doctor who died in 1985. Spezzi claimed Narducci had been part of a secret society and that his death had been staged to look like a drowning, when in fact, it was likely murder. To silence him. For that, Spezzi was arrested in 2006, charged with obstructing justice. He spent 22 days in prison without formal accusation. Later, all charges were dropped. But the message was clear. The deeper you dig, the more dangerous this case becomes. Here's something I've never forgotten. Spezzi once said in an interview, "The monster case is not just a mystery. It is a mirror. Look too long and you'll see yourself inside it." And I think he was right, because by now the monster wasn't just a killer. He was a national trauma, a story woven into the DNA of Florence, an invisible thread stretching from vineyard to chapel, farmhouse to courtroom. When I visited San Casciano years later, the locals didn't like to talk, not because they had secrets, but because they had memories. One man told me, the monster didn't die, he just changed names. And when I asked what he meant, he smiled and pointed up at the hill. "He's up there," he said, "in one of those houses, or maybe in your story." There's a point in every unsolved case when the facts turn into folklore. That happened to the monster of Florence sometime around the year 2000. And by the time I returned to Italy years later, the story was no longer about bullets and bodies. It had become something mythic. That's when I started digging into what people whispered but rarely said aloud, that the killings weren't just of lust or madness, but rituals. Let me explain. It all goes back to Francesco Narducci, the doctor found floating in Lake Trasimeno in 1985. He was never officially linked to the monster case, at least not publicly. But the details surrounding his death were deeply strange. Initially, the autopsy ruled it a suicide by drowning. No bruises, no trauma, no toxins. Case closed. But years later, under pressure from a separate investigation, his body was exhumed. And everything changed. New tests showed no water in the lungs, signs of strangulation, and no correlation between the body's condition and the lake's temperature, suggesting the body may have been stored elsewhere before being dumped. Officially, this reopened the possibility that Narducci had been murdered. But by whom? Here comes the theory that refuses to die, that Narducci was part of a Masonic-style secret society operating in Tuscany, an elite circle of doctors, judges, intellectuals, and aristocrats with a taste for the occult. According to this theory, the monster killings weren't random acts of violence. They were ritual sacrifices, executed according to an esoteric template, always on a Saturday. Always a couple in an isolated vehicle. Always a female victim disfigured in a specific way. Always with signs of post-mortem ritualism, mutilations with near-surgical precision. The suggestion was that the killer or killers delivered trophies, wombs, pubic areas, other organs, to someone higher up. The most prominent advocate of this theory wasn't a conspiracy theorist, but a judge. Giuliano Mignini, who also prosecuted the Amanda Knox case, led an investigation into what he called the monster sect. And he wasn't alone. Police reports from the early 2000s referenced a possible group called La Setta dei Mostri, the sect of the monsters. One confidential informant claimed the cult used ancient Tuscan farmhouses for ritual meetings and even described black masses, a mix of pagan rites and mutilation. Now, to be clear, none of this was ever proven. The Italian justice system never convicted anyone of being part of such a group. Many dismissed it as tabloid hysteria or prosecutorial overreach. And yet, the circumstantial links kept adding up. One photo showed mutilation marks on a victim that mirrored diagrams in occult manuals seized from suspects in a related probe. Another victim's date of death aligned with a moon phase tied to feminine sacrifice in obscure pagan traditions. I'm not saying I fully believe this theory, but I can say this. The level of organization, consistency, and precision in the monster's attacks has never fit the profile of a typical lone wolf killer. Here's the strange fact of the night. In 1984, a priest in Florence received a confession letter typed in Latin. It included verses from an apocryphal gospel and ended with the line, "She was not a woman, she was the offering." The priest handed it to police. It was never released to the public. Later, it vanished from the archives. So what are we supposed to do with all this? Let's turn to the ongoing scholarly debate. Can courts of law ever reliably engage with crimes that blur the lines between psychology, symbolism, and secrecy? Or are we forced to choose between dismissing everything as delusion or believing in things the legal system isn't designed to prove? Many criminologists argue that by the late 1990s, the monster case collapsed under its own mythology. Too many suspects, too many theories, too many coincidences. The real truth, they say, became permanently obscured. Others argue that this is exactly the purpose of ritual crime, not clean murders, but performances, designed to generate chaos and deflect blame. I met one researcher in Bologna who told me, if this was just a sexual serial killer, the case would have been solved by now. The evidence was clean. The scenes were isolated. No messy trophies. No fingerprints. No DNA. The monster didn't make mistakes. That means he didn't work alone. Then he showed me a map, He'd connected the exact GPS coordinates of each crime scene. They formed a near-perfect spiral, curling inward from the hills outside Florence toward the city center, almost like a ritual enclosure. Coincidence? He didn't think so, and neither did the surviving families. In 2007, I spoke with the cousin of Pia Rontini, the 1984 victim. She was only 18 years old, a nurse. Her cousin said the monster didn't just kill her. He took her away from the world, as if she belonged to something he wanted to remove. He didn't blame someone like Pacciani. He believed something larger was behind it. So I asked him gently if he thought the truth would ever come out. He shook his head. The truth is buried under stone, not dirt, stone. And I realized then, in Florence, some stories are older than we think. Some don't get solved. They just echo forever. There's a name that keeps appearing, then vanishing. A name the police once believed could blow the monster case wide open, but over time it disappeared from the files, the press, even the courtroom transcripts. That name? Antonio Vinci. Let's rewind. By the early 2000s, police had already arrested and tried Pietro Pacciani, the aging farmer many believed to be the monster. He was convicted, then acquitted, and then ordered to be retried, before dying under suspicious circumstances in 1998. Two of his closest companions, Mario Vanni and Giancarlo Lotti, were also tried as alleged accomplices. They became known as the Compagni di Merende, roughly translated as picnic buddies. Small-town men with limited education, murky pasts, and erratic behavior. But during Lotti's interrogation, something unexpected came up. A name. I remember another man who was there with a car. He didn't talk much. I think his name was Antonio. Vinci. Yes, Antonio Vinci. The police ran the name. What they found raised serious questions. Antonio Vinci was the nephew of Salvatore Vinci, a Sardinian immigrant and former suspect in the monster case back in the 1960s. In fact, Salvatore's wife had died in a suspicious house fire in 1961. At the time, her death was classified as a domestic accident, but investigators later re-examined it as a possible precursor to the monster killings. Antonio, the nephew, would have been in his late 20s during the final two monster murders. He had a criminal record for petty violence, stalking, and according to one report, animal mutilation. He lived within 10 kilometers of all the last crime scenes. And then things got stranger. In 2003, an anonymous letter arrived at the prosecutor's office in Florence. Typed, no return address. Inside was a single page. It read, open quote, the one you seek is not Pacciani, nor Vanni. The son of the fire holds the key. He walks with the ashes of his mother. Close quote. The police were stunned. The son of the fire could only mean Antonio Vinci, whose mother died in a mysterious blaze. They attempted to bring him in, but Vinci had already vanished. He had left Italy 2 months earlier, allegedly bound for France. There was no record of border crossings, no flights booked in his name, no trace in immigration databases. He was gone. Some believe he disappeared deliberately. Others think he was silenced. Which brings us to tonight's strange fact. In 2005, an Italian journalist claimed to have found Vinci living in Avignon, France, under a false name. He even recorded a short video interview, grainy, shot at night. The man denied being Vinci, but midway through the clip, he said something strange. Open quote, Florence eats her sons. I never had a chance. Close quote. Days later, the journalist's car was vandalized and his hard drive was stolen. The footage was never aired again. So why didn't the police pursue it further? That leads us into the deeper debate. Can a justice system, overwhelmed by media pressure and decades of conspiracy, truly prioritize new leads over protecting its reputation? Because once you've put men behind bars, do you really want to admit you might have gotten it wrong? Many investigators had grown weary of the monster case. It had consumed their careers. Still, there was no resolution. Bringing in a new suspect, especially one possibly connected to theories about secret societies or ritual crimes, meant reopening everything, reopening the pain, confronting questions no one wanted to face. And so, Antonio Vinci faded into the mist, but a few traces remained. From the final monster crime scene in 1985, police recovered 3 peculiar pieces of evidence. A footprint that didn't match Pacciani or Vanni, a length of black nylon cord, unlike any used in the earlier crimes, and a hand-drawn sketch, a spiral carved into the bark of a nearby tree with 2 initials, AV. It was dismissed at the time as a prank by local teens. But years later, a forensic botanist testified that the carving was likely at least 15 years old, meaning it was made around the time of the murder. Another overlooked detail, buried in the archives. A criminology professor I interviewed in Rome told me, without hesitation, open quote, "The Vinci lead made people very uncomfortable. He fit too many patterns, not just the criminal profile, but the symbolic one. The fire, the disappearance, the silence. He became a ghost, and that was convenient for everyone." Close quote. So where does that leave us? We're in a story with too many endings. And maybe that's the point. In Florence, they say the city remembers everything, but it doesn't always speak. Maybe Antonio Vinci was innocent. Maybe he was the missing piece. Or maybe he's still watching the case, the same way we are, waiting for the truth to come back into fashion. As one investigator put it, open quote, "The monster didn't need to be caught. He needed to be believed." Close quote. And that's the hardest thing to do when belief turns into fear and fear becomes silence. Let's talk about something the tabloids never covered. Not the murders, not the guns, but a diary, small, leather-bound, wrapped in a velvet handkerchief, found in a private psychiatric clinic just outside Siena. It belonged to a man named Dr. Francesco Narducci, and if that name doesn't ring a bell, don't worry. It was never supposed to. Narducci was a well-regarded gastroenterologist from Perugia, educated, affluent, and by all outward appearances, ordinary. Except for one detail. In 1985, just weeks after the final monster of Florence killing, he vanished. Poof, gone, while out boating on Lake Trasimeno. 2 days later, his body was discovered floating near the shore. No bruises, no wounds, no obvious signs of foul play. So the case was closed. Cause of death? Suicide by drowning. But here's the question. Why would a man with no history of depression, no suicide note, and no warning signs suddenly take his own life after enjoying a peaceful lunch with friends? And that's where things begin to unravel. Nearly 20 years later, in 2002, investigators reopened his case. Why? Because forensic anomalies were found in the body. His skin showed signs of prolonged refrigeration. His stomach contents didn't align with the time of death. And, shockingly, his corpse had been temporarily swapped with another. Let that settle in for a moment. A respected doctor's body was hidden, preserved, then later floated out to simulate a drowning. But why? That's where the diary enters the picture. It wasn't discovered until 2005, buried deep within the archives of a psychiatric clinic. At first glance, its entries read like cryptic poetry, but beneath the surface, the metaphors were deeply disturbing. Open quote, "The blood of Venus must flow again. The key sleeps in a rose. The others are watching. I fear they will remove me soon." Close quote. What does that sound like to you? To prosecutors, it was coded language. References to ritual murder, fertility cults, and symbolic imagery eerily consistent with details from the monster case, particularly the genital mutilations. Others disagreed. Narducci's family insisted he had suffered a nervous breakdown shortly before his death. That the diary was part of a therapeutic exercise written during private psychiatric treatment. As for the clinic where the diary was found, its files were partially destroyed in a mysterious fire, just 1 week after journalists began asking questions. And consider this. The nurse who originally discovered the diary claimed she saw a black rose pressed between its pages. But when police examined it a week later, no Rose. She never changed her story. Not even once. She died of a heart attack in 2012. No autopsy was performed. Here's tonight's strange fact. Handwriting experts concluded that two separate entries in the diary were written by different people, but forensic analysis couldn't determine who wrote which. Some believe Narducci was transcribing messages dictated to him, perhaps under coercion. And now, the implications. In 2006, prosecutors leveled a bold accusation that Narducci was connected to a clandestine group associated with or adjacent to the monster killings. Not the killer himself, but part of something larger. An underground network of intellectuals, doctors, and elites who collected and possibly commissioned murder. They called it the Order of the Red Rose. Sound theatrical? Maybe. But soon, the evidence began stacking up. Suspicious bank transfers, encrypted phone records, ties to Florentine Masonic lodges. One witness even claimed to have seen a group of robed men conducting a strange ritual in the woods near Vicchio, the same area where two victims were found in 1984. And here's where the academic debate ignites. Criminologists remain divided. Was the Order of the Red Rose a real, organized cult? Or was it just a desperate prosecutorial fantasy, a convenient villain to give structure to a series of otherwise inexplicable crimes? Some experts still argue the monster was a lone psychopath. Others believe the surgical precision of the mutilations, the timing, and the ritualistic elements all point to an organized group with a darker, more symbolic agenda. So what do I think? Too many powerful people had too much to lose. And every time someone got close to exposing something, they vanished, or were discredited, or drowned in lakes. Even Narducci's ex-wife was never publicly interviewed. When asked why, the lead prosecutor responded cryptically, open quote, "Some rooms are better left dark," close quote. So was Dr. Francesco Narducci a pawn, a prophet, or a participant? The diary never gave us an answer, but it whispered. And sometimes whispers are worse than screams, especially when they're etched into leather, sealed in velvet, and left behind for someone to find, long after the blood has dried. I remember the first time someone whispered it to me. We were on a train cutting through the Tuscan hills, just after dusk. A retired police archivist leaned across the aisle and said, "It wasn't the killings that scared me. It was the car, that white Fiat 127. Always parked where it shouldn't be." He had worked the Vicchio case back in 1984, and ever since then, the same model, same chipped paint on the left door, kept appearing in photographs, statements, and eyewitness accounts tied to several of the double murders. Always near the crime scenes. Never too close, never too far. Like a ghost that wanted to be seen, but not caught. But let's rewind to the night of September 7th, 1985. The last known attack by the monster. Claudio Stefanacci and Pia Gildarantini, young lovers, barely out of their teens, were spending the evening parked in Claudio's car near San Casciano. It was supposed to be just another night under the stars. Except, a white Fiat was seen idling near the olive groves that night. A shepherd walking his dog reported it. He said the driver was wearing a priest's cassock. He thought it was strange. A priest at midnight, watching parked cars at a lover spot? 2 hours later, Claudio and Pia were found murdered. Same MO, gunshots first, then surgical mutilation. And just like the others, Pia's body had been staged, carefully, even theatrically. But this time, the killer left something behind. A page from a liturgical hymn book, torn neatly and folded into Pia's shirt collar. The police never made that detail public. I only found out through a journalist who uncovered it during a 2007 trial. She believed the page came from a midnight mass booklet used in a very specific ritual practiced by certain Masonic-adjacent religious sects. Groups that wore cassocks. Groups that saw sex, blood, and death as symbolic rebirth. And the white Fiat? It was registered to a man named Mario Vanni, a retired postman known for his eccentric habits and fascination with esoteric rituals. But here's the kicker. Vanni had an alibi. He claimed to be in a nearby town that night, attending a charity dinner. There was even a photo of him smiling in the background, next to a different Fiat, a blue one. But when investigators zoomed in, the man driving that car looked suspiciously like someone else entirely. Pietro Pacciani. Yeah, that guy. Now here's your weird fact. Forensic analysis of the hymn page found on Pia's body revealed traces of rare saffron oil, commonly used in certain religious anointing rituals, and also in 18th century Freemason funeral rites. Explain that. Historians and criminologists still argue over the Fiat 127 mystery. Some say it's just coincidence. After all, the Fiat 127 was the second most popular car in Italy during the 1980s. But others insist the sightings form a deliberate pattern, always parked near lovers' lanes, always within sight, but never on any official suspect's vehicle list. And there's more. In 1996, an anonymous tip led police to a burned-out barn outside San Casciano. Inside, they found fragments of a cassock, melted candles, and the rusted frame of what appeared to be a Fiat 127, stripped and torched. Tests dated the fire to roughly 1986, less than a year after the final killing. The cassock, stained with something that tested positive for goat blood, and traces of human female DNA. They never identified whose. But guess what else was in that barn? A silver key. Still warm to the touch even though the fire had long gone out, and scratched faintly into the wooden door, almost invisible. Come unto me, ye blessed of my Father. Matthew 25:34. That verse, often read at funerals, also used in initiation rites by obscure religious brotherhoods. So let me ask you this. How many overlapping themes do you need before something stops looking like coincidence and starts looking like design? Every time we got close to the monster's identity, the trail vanished, like mist in the hills. But the Fiat kept returning, like a ghost or a chariot, depending on how you look at it. And the man in the cassock? Still unidentified. To this day, locals claim they sometimes see him walking the dirt roads near San Casciano on summer nights. Always just before a thunderstorm, always looking toward the olive groves. Maybe it's just village legend, maybe it's memory playing tricks, or maybe some doors never really close. They just wait for someone foolish enough to knock. People in Florence don't talk much about La Notte dei Vetri Neri, the night of black glass. You won't find it in any newspapers. It doesn't appear in court records. But if you linger long enough at a bar near Piazza della Signoria and buy someone a grappa, someone always slips up and mentions it. It happened in late 1987, after the last public investigation into the monster had stalled once again. Evidence was falling apart. Witnesses were recanting. And then a strange silence began to spread, slow and mold-like, through the justice system. Police archives were discreetly reorganized. Certain forensic photographs vanished. Files were moved, renamed, or destroyed due to so-called humidity damage. Convenient, isn't it? But the worst was what happened to those who tried to break that silence. There was a young female magistrate, brilliant, stubborn, and outspoken, who announced plans to reopen the case. She claimed it was connected to a small secret society operating in Tuscany since the 1960s. She said she had names. She said the monster was never just one man. It was a ritual, a rotating mask passed down. 2 weeks later, she resigned, citing stress, and disappeared from public life. Today, she lives under a new name in Argentina. No joke. One of the lead forensic pathologists, the one who first noted the surgical precision in the female mutilations, died of a heart attack while swimming in a hotel pool. His autopsy report disappeared. And then came what locals now whisper about as the night of black glass. One night. 3 independent journalists, each investigating the monster case, each suffering unrelated accidents within a 4-hour window. A car crash, a fall from a balcony, a gas leak. Only one survived, the man who fell from the balcony. He woke up with a shattered femur and fractured skull. When he recovered, he gave a single interview before vanishing forever. He said, "There are people who eat silence for breakfast. The monster was only the bait. What lives beneath it is older." Let that sink in. The case files from the late 80s show a complete narrative shift after that night. All Masonic references? Gone. The white Fiat? Dismissed as unreliable. The cassock detail? Redacted. The barn full of ritual tools? Written off as vagrant debris. Suddenly, the monster became just Pietro Pacciani again, an angry peasant with a gun and a twisted obsession. Case closed. But was it? Here's a strange fact. In 1998, 5 Italian criminologists received anonymous carbon-copied letters. Each one contained the same phrase, written in mirror script. "The skin is a curtain, the eye is a liar." The paper was aged. The ink? A rare 1930s clerical calligraphy formula. One expert traced the paper to a now defunct seminary print shop outside Siena. Sound familiar? The debate still rages. Historians argue whether the monster was a lone killer or the front for a cult staging public theater, rituals concealing something older, darker, or political. Some believe the murders were a distraction. Others think they were message rituals, warnings etched in flesh for those in the know. Meanwhile, the monster of Florence became more than just a name. It became a brand, a media construct. Profitable, comfortable, and conveniently misleading. Even crime documentaries played along. They focused on Pacciani's violent past, his criminal record, his courtroom behavior, but rarely asked, if Pacciani really was the monster, why did the killing stop in 1985, even though he remained free? Why did the surgical precision never appear again, even in alleged copycat crimes? Why were the ritual elements erased from every official file, despite being privately confirmed by forensic experts? Because there was a pact, an unspoken agreement among powerful people, to end the monster myth by reducing him to one man, then burying the rest. And it worked, mostly, except for one man, the priest, not a real priest, the man in the Fiat 127. He was seen again in 2001 by a retired train conductor who swore he spotted a man in a cassock staring into the Arno River at 3:33 a.m. He blinked. The man was gone. A hallucination? Maybe. But here's the real twist. That same week, a small church near Vicchio reported a break-in. Nothing was stolen, but someone had placed a single white rose on the altar. Beside it was a burned photograph of Pia Rontini. Tucked into the petals, a note bearing the verse from Matthew 25:34. Time folds in strange ways here. Some wounds in Tuscany never healed. They were sealed with symbols, not justice. They were disguised as justice so they could fester out of sight. Maybe the monster was more than one man, or maybe the monster was a town, a culture, a system. But either way, everyone agrees, if you want to stay safe in Florence, you don't ask about the monster after dark. They called her La Voce, the voice. She wasn't in the case files, not officially, but in a small village near Scandicci, not far from where 2 of the victims were found in 1981, lived an elderly woman who had once worked as a cleaning lady at the Florence courthouse. She never gave interviews, never left the region, but everyone in the village knew she had heard something. And one afternoon, during my final week in Tuscany, I found her. She was sitting beneath an olive tree, feeding stray cats and humming Ave Maria off-key. I introduced myself politely and mentioned that I was researching the old murders. Her eyes didn't flinch. She simply said, "You're looking for ghosts. You'll find them, but don't ask me to join them." It took time and trust, but eventually she spoke, in fragments. Not like a witness, but like someone peeling back trauma, word by word. She had worked at the courthouse from 1975 to 1990, cleaned the floors after the judges left, emptied trash bins, refilled soap. Nothing more. But she listened. She watched. And sometimes they forgot she was even in the room. She told me about one night in 1984, a private conversation between two magistrates and a bishop. It happened after one of the monster killings. She'd been dusting behind the coat rack, out of sight. They weren't discussing arrests or evidence. They were arguing about preservation, preserving an ancient channel, she said, preserving the covenant. One of them said, "He's gone too far. The girl's heart was still warm." Another whispered, "It's not about blood anymore. It's about visibility, control. The message must end." She remembered it clearly. Because of that phrase, the message must end. She said the same phrase appeared 2 years later in a memo that was supposed to be shredded. She found it before the cleaning staff was ordered to destroy it. It was unsigned. It simply read, open quote, "The vineyard must be pruned, all visible rot removed, then silence will grow again. The message must end." Close quote. She kept the memo for a year, hidden in a Bible. Then one day, someone broke into her apartment. Nothing was stolen, except the Bible. She never spoke of it again. Until me. When I asked her what she truly believed, she smiled faintly and looked toward the olive grove. "I believe we made a deal, a dirty deal, to feed something old, not Satan, something older. I think Florence wanted to forget her sins, but sins always remember." Then she said something I'll never forget. Every 20 years, the river asks for another name. She wouldn't explain, and I didn't press her, because her hands were trembling, and one of the cats had started growling at the sky. Strange fact of the day? In 2005, a property developer discovered an underground stone room beneath an abandoned church just north of Florence. There were no stairs, no doors, just a sealed hatch beneath the altar. Inside, 6 chairs arranged in a circle, a mirror embedded in the floor, a rusted surgical kit, and a single fresco, a faceless priest holding a lamb split in two. Carbon dating placed the room's construction in the early 20th century, not medieval. No records existed of renovations, permits, or any religious activity tied to that church. To this day, no one knows what the room was used for. Locals call it La Culla del Silencio, the cradle of silence. And here's where things spiral. That mirror on the floor, it was engraved around the edge in Latin, open quote, "Veritas incruore, oculus in tenebris." Truth in blood, the eye in darkness, close quote. And that brings us back to the very first crime scene. Remember the lovers in the car in 1974? Remember how one of the victims, the male, wasn't mutilated, only shot? What if the killings weren't just symbolic, but corrective? What if they were looking for something inside the victims, a code, a bloodline, a clue? What if one of the women had seen something or was carrying something? That theory exists. It's fringe, but real. Some researchers believe the monster's killings were a form of dark vetting, eliminating anyone who had come into contact with a particular object, symbol, or ritual and survived. The real question becomes, who else walked away? That's when the voice gave me one final gift. She showed me an old, cracked photograph she kept under her pillow. It was a group shot. 12 people, all in black, standing outside a rural chapel. In the center, a young man with pale eyes and a faraway stare. She whispered, "He walked out, the only one, and he remembers." I asked who he was. She only said, "He's the real witness, but he's forgotten his own face." Then she closed her eyes and didn't speak again that day. What if she was right? What if this case never needed solving because the ones who began it erased themselves? What if the monster wasn't caught because he was never meant to be? I returned to Florence one last time in the spring. Tourists flooded the Piazza della Signoria, laughing beneath the replica statues of David and Perseus. But I hadn't come for the art. I came for the river. The Arno has always felt like a silent observer, still yet knowing. Locals joke that the Arno remembers every lie thrown into it, that it keeps secrets better than any priest or grave. And I had one final name to chase: the man from the photo. La Voce said he walked away from a ritual, that he forgot his own face. I assumed it was a metaphor. Trauma. Until I found the archives from the psychiatric ward at San Salvi. Buried deep in the files, badly redacted, I found him. Giulio Belandi, born 1953, vanished 1976. Declared mentally incompetent at age 22 following a violent fugue episode. He had wandered naked into a church in Borgo San Lorenzo, speaking Latin, his body marked with geometric cuts. The priest claimed Giulio kept repeating, "The eye is open, I cannot close it. The spiral eats its tail." After being admitted to San Salvi, Giulio reportedly forgot his own name. Doctors said he only responded to Gregorian chants and refused to look into mirrors. In 1982, he escaped. Never found again. But in 1995, a man calling himself Giulio B. appeared at a commune in Switzerland, living under a new name, painting strange symbols in black oil on the walls of his hut. He had a long scar running down his chest, almost surgical. And when questioned about his past, he said, "I dreamed I was two people. One was me, the other was watching." Swiss authorities released him. He was deemed harmless. He vanished again. And to this day, that trail ends in fog. So, what's the takeaway? Let me offer something strange, something speculative, but something that fits. There's a theory, rarely spoken aloud, that the monster of Florence wasn't a man. Not exactly, that he was a role, passed from one person to another, not like a profession, but a burden, a mask. The killings were rites, not acts of worship, but of sustenance, feeding something that required precision, ritual, pairing, not just killing, selection. And that selection wasn't about the victims. It was about the witnesses. Only those who saw could become. There are documents locked away in private collections suggesting similar crimes took place in Marseille, 1939, Ghent, 1921, Prague, 1904. Each with eerily similar hallmarks: young couples, mutilations focused on reproductive organs, internal organs removed, always near churches or ancient symbols. Each wave ends quietly. After 7 or 8 murders, then silence. Until the next place, the next vessel. And here's the final chilling footnote. In 2006, a woman from Reggio Emilia came forward with a diary. Her father had been a police photographer in Florence during the 1980s. He took his own life in 1997, leaving behind the diary, and a roll of undeveloped negatives. In the diary, he described one photo that haunted him. It wasn't technically a crime scene. It was a photograph of an empty mirror, cracked down the center, taken in 1985 inside an unused chapel in the hills. But here's the twist. He swore that when he took the photo, he saw himself in it. Only it wasn't the man he was. He looked older, wore a gray coat, held a different model of camera, and when the film was developed, there was nothing, just the mirror, and a note scrawled in the white margin: "I watched myself take this. I did not blink." In the diary, he wrote that after that moment, he began hearing things. A voice narrating his actions, always just a second behind. Soft, calm, and always ending with the same phrase: "It is your turn now." He never developed the negatives. His daughter did in 2007. All were blank, except the last, a black image. But when you enhance the contrast, you can just make out a spiral, scratched into the corner. I left Florence the next morning. I didn't look in mirrors that day. I haven't since. Strange fact? In 2023, during renovations of an old prison in Tuscany, workers found a small object lodged behind a wall. A bronze medallion, no bigger than a coin. One side, a spiral within a spiral. The other side, Il cerchio non si spezza. The circle never breaks. So what do I believe? I believe the monster of Florence was caught, many times, but he was never jailed, because jails don't hold rituals. I believe Giulio Belandi saw something we weren't meant to see, and he forgot himself to survive it. I believe the woman under the olive tree still waits for the next name to be taken by the river. And I believe the spiral is still turning, in the dark, in the silence, behind the next mirror, waiting for whoever blinks first. Have a good night's sleep.